Be very careful, because the moment you stop being a man and start becoming her fantasy, you disappear. You think you're being loved, seen, chosen, but what's actually happening is far more dangerous than rejection. You're being absorbed into a dream she's been having since before she even met you, a role written not by you, but by a part of her she doesn't even know exists. And once you no longer fit that role, the dream doesn't stop, it simply finds a new actor. Carl Jung had a word for this, projection. But this isn't the simple psychological cliché you might be thinking of. This is archetypal, ancient. He spoke of something deeper, what he called the Animus, the inner masculine image living inside the psyche of every woman. And when undeveloped, this Animus doesn't bring wisdom or strength, it brings confusion. It brings fantasy. It brings control. When a woman hasn't faced this part of herself, it becomes an unconscious tyrant, and that tyrant demands a character, not a man. So here you are, feeling desired, needed, even adored. But if you're honest, something always felt off. Maybe you couldn't name it, but deep down you sensed it, that strange weight behind her affection, that eerie precision with which she seemed to know you before she really did. The way she interpreted everything you did as part of a bigger story, a story you didn't write. You were never free to be messy, real, or evolving. You were expected to embody something larger than life, something impossible. In the beginning, it feels flattering, like you've been discovered, but in reality, you're being cast, measured, fitted into a mold, and Jung warned, when the Animus projects onto a man, he is no longer seen as human. He becomes a symbol, a tool, a psychological container for her own inner work that she hasn't done. But here's the real tragedy. Most men never realize it, not until it's too late. You confuse being desired with being known. You think being chosen means being understood. You fall into the trap every uninitiated man does, believing that love is something given to you, not something you create within yourself. And because of that, you start bending, shaping, performing. You become what you think she wants. You ignore your boundaries. You silence your instincts. You betray your truth, just to keep her looking at you the way she did in the beginning. And then one day, without warning, the light in her eyes changes. The gaze that once thrilled you is now empty, bored, even disgusted. You didn't change, you just failed to keep the fantasy alive. But the truth is, this was never about you. This was about the Animus, the internal man she spent her life dialoguing with, the one who always says the right thing, saves the day, holds her in perfect tenderness and perfect strength. And you, with your flaws and moods and wounds, you never stood a chance. You were real. She was in love with a ghost. Now you're left holding the pieces, wondering what you did wrong, but you didn't do anything wrong, you just stopped acting. And that's the moment every projection collapses. Jung said it best. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But projection doesn't want transformation. It wants reenactment. Repetition. It wants you to stay still so the story can continue. And this is where most men fall apart, because we've been trained to believe our worth comes from being wanted, from being useful, from being chosen. And in this psychological theater, we play our roles so well, we forget they're not even ours. We live to maintain the illusion, until the illusion no longer needs us. Then we spiral into rage, into shame, into obsessive overthinking. We want answers, closure, anything that helps us make sense of why we suddenly feel like a stranger in our own life. But the answer is brutal. You were never being loved. You were being imagined. So, what now? This is the crossroads. You can try to become more convincing, more charming, more aligned with the fantasy. You can try to get her back by becoming less of yourself. Or you can step off the stage entirely. You can begin the work Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are, not who someone else needs you to be. And here's the hard part. It starts with confronting your own shadow. Because as much as her animus projected a fantasy onto you, it only worked because your shadow let it. Because deep down, you wanted to be seen as special, as savior, as exception. You needed her idealization to feel whole. That's the uncomfortable truth. This wasn't just about her. This was your unconscious colluding with hers. Two incomplete psyches trying to use each other to avoid looking inward. But once you see this clearly, everything begins to change. You stop chasing, you stop performing, you stop needing to be chosen. And that's when the real journey begins. The journey back to yourself. Now you begin to see it. All the times you said yes when you meant no. All the times you swallowed your truth to preserve a connection that was never truly yours. You weren't being a partner. You were playing a part. And the most dangerous part of all, you thought it made you more lovable. You thought bending would bring closeness. You thought becoming her dream would finally give you the belonging you never had. But belonging that costs you your identity isn't love, it's self-erasure. Jung called this self-betrayal. It's the subtle, repeated act of abandoning your own inner compass to maintain an image, one that pleases others but starves your soul. And you know what it feels like. The quiet resentment, the emotional fatigue, that sense that no matter how much you give, it's never enough, that no matter how perfectly you perform, the applause always fades. This is not love. This is entrapment in a narrative that was written before you even arrive. What makes this dynamic so toxic is how invisible it is, because on the surface it looks romantic, passionate, even fated. She says she's never met anyone like you. She sees something in you that no one else does, and for a moment you feel like a god, like you matter in a way you never have before. But underneath the fantasy is a ticking clock. Because no one can stay a symbol forever. Eventually your humanity leaks through, you get tired, you say the wrong thing, you stop performing, and in that moment you're no longer the fantasy, you're a disappointment. It hits hard, not because you lost her, but because you never felt more alive than when you were the center of someone else's dream, and now that dream is gone, and with it the reflection you mistook for your identity. This is the moment most men scramble. They double down on self-improvement, try to win her back, or throw themselves into the next fantasy. Anything to avoid the truth they don't want to face. The truth is this: you don't know who you are without being desired. You've built your sense of self around being chosen, being wanted, being needed. But when your identity is based on someone else's gaze, you will never be free. Because the moment that gaze turns elsewhere, you vanish. So you have a choice: stay in the cycle or break it completely. But to break it, you have to face something most men never do. Your own shadow, the part of you that craves validation, that fears being invisible, that secretly hopes love will fix what childhood broke. This is the core, this is the fracture, and unless you address it, you will keep walking into relationships that feed on your unresolved wounds. This is why Jung placed individuation at the center of psychological freedom, because until you become whole within yourself, every relationship will be a projection, either yours or theirs. You will attract what you haven't integrated. You will perform what you haven't healed. You will lose yourself in the very thing you thought would save you. So what does individuation look like? It looks like becoming emotionally sovereign. It looks like no longer bending to be palatable. It looks like telling the truth, even when it costs you. It looks like choosing solitude over self-abandonment. Jung was clear: the path to wholeness is not a group journey. It is walked alone. And it is brutal. Because it asks you to give up every mask you've worn to feel safe. It asks you to stand without applause, without affirmation, without a script. And when you do, something shifts. You stop attracting women who want to control you through fantasy. You stop feeling desperate for love that only reflects back a hollow version of you. You start seeing clearly. You begin to notice the subtle manipulation, the performance in others, the game. and you don't want to play it anymore, not because you're bitter, but because you finally know who you are. A man who has walked through his shadow, a man who doesn't need to be a fantasy, a man who is rooted, not reactive, grounded, not grasping, unshakable, because his value no longer comes from how others see him, but from who he knows himself to be. And the irony? That's when you become most magnetic, not because you're trying to be, but because you radiate authenticity. You no longer need to perform so people finally feel you. You no longer chase so people lean in. You no longer prove so people listen. This is not charisma. This is clarity, and clarity is rare. Women feel it, especially those still trapped in their own unconscious projections. Some will be drawn to it, others will be threatened, but you won't be swayed either way, because you no longer exist to be imagined. You exist to be real, and you're willing to be alone if that's what real demands. This is where everything changes. Not when you get the girl, not when you win her back, not when you finally become desirable enough to be chosen. Everything changes when you stop needing any of that. When you stand in your center and declare, I no longer need to be the fantasy, I am the reality. And that, more than anything, terrifies the unconscious Animus. Because the fantasy was never meant to meet something so alive, so grounded, so unshakably real. And it doesn't know what to do with that. You start to see just how deeply the world rewards you for being fake. Not just women, not just relationships, everything. Society doesn't want you to be whole, it wants you to be functional, predictable, easy to categorize, and being a fantasy fits that model perfectly. You're either the hero, the provider, the bad boy, the rebel, the genius, the safe guy, the fixer, the empath. Pick a role, play it well, and maybe, just maybe, you'll be loved. But that's not love. That's theater. That's unconscious programming masquerading as connection. And once you've tasted reality, even a sip of it, you'll find it harder and harder to go back to pretending. Because pretending costs you more than it gives. It strips you of vitality, it robs you of voice, and eventually it empties you to the point where even being desired feels like a burden. You may have noticed this already, that strange fatigue that sets in after a relationship, the hollow feeling that lingers even in the middle of intimacy. You smile, you say the right things, but something inside you is silent, distant, watching the whole performance like it's a movie you've already seen. And that's because it is. You've lived this loop before, over and over again, different names, same script. And somewhere along the way, you forgot who you were before you started performing. That's the moment of crisis, and it's also the moment of truth. Because here's what Jung knew. The unconscious doesn't let you lie to yourself forever. Sooner or later it forces you to look. Through breakdown, through betrayal, through inexplicable emptiness. And when it does, you have a choice. Numb yourself and return to the stage, or step off of it for good and face who you really are. That's when the real shadow work begins. It's not pretty, it's not poetic. It doesn't look like journaling under soft lighting with soothing music in the background. It looks like rage, like grief, like sitting in your own silence and realizing how much of your life you've handed over to be validated, needed, admired. Shadow work is the death of the illusion, and that death hurts, because it exposes how long you've been living on someone else's terms. But in that death, something new emerges, something ancient, something sovereign. You begin to remember the man you were before the projections, before the stories, before you learned to edit yourself in exchange for approval. He's not perfect, he's not polished, but he's real, and he's been waiting for you. He's the one who says no, not to be difficult, but because it's the truth. He's the one who walks away from love that asks him to shrink. He's the one who sits in solitude, not as punishment, but as practice, because he's preparing to never abandon himself again. That's individuation, not becoming better, becoming whole. And whole men are dangerous to illusions, to systems, to stories that require self-sacrifice to function, because a whole man cannot be manipulated. He cannot be seduced by fantasy or controlled by need. He does not chase attention. He commands it by existing. He does not fear rejection. He accepts it as part of the cost of being real. And, perhaps most importantly, he no longer confuses love with performance. That's what changes everything in relationships. You stop trying to be the one she's been dreaming about, and you start being the one who is fully here, grounded, awake, unapologetically alive. You don't speak to impress, you speak to express. You don't soften your edges to be more likable. You own your roughness, because it's part of your truth. And when she meets you, really meets you, something wild happens. Either her fantasy crumbles and she leaves, or it shatters and she wakes up too. But either way, you're free. You're no longer tethered to her unconscious projections. You're no longer at the mercy of her moods, her myths, her silent expectations. You're no longer performing in a play you didn't audition for. You're here, in this moment, and you finally belong to yourself. That's the moment you stop fearing solitude, because solitude isn't absence, it's alignment. It's where you remember your voice, your vision, your power. And when someone enters your life now, they're not walking into a vacuum desperate to be filled. They're entering a temple that's already full. That's the difference. When you were a character in her fantasy, you needed her to complete you. Now that you're the author of your own reality, you can see her clearly. Her beauty and her blindness, her depth and her delusion, her light and her shadow. And you don't need to fix her, save her, or become her dream. You just need to be yourself, fully, relentlessly, unedited. Some women will walk away from that, and that's okay, because you're not here to be universally adored, you're here to be real, and realness is polarizing. But the woman who stays, the one who sees you without projecting onto you, that woman is rare, because she's done her own work, she's faced her animus, she's withdrawn her fantasies, she doesn't need a character, she wants a man. And now, finally, you are one. Not because of what you've accomplished, not because you're unbreakable, but because you've integrated, you've taken your fragments and made something whole. And wholeness can't be replaced. Not in someone else's story, not in your own. This is where most men stop. Because they think they've reached the end of the journey. They've stepped out of the role, reclaimed their identity, stopped being a puppet in someone else's fantasy. And yes, that is liberation, but it's only the threshold. Because now comes the real test. Not just can you leave the fantasy, but can you hold your reality? Can you stand in your truth even when it costs you connection? Can you speak your boundaries before they're crossed, not after you've been broken? Can you love without merging, give without losing, connect without becoming invisible? These are the trials of the individuated man, and they are not easy, because the temptation to perform never fully disappears. The desire to be seen as valuable, as wanted, as the one, it still flickers in moments of weakness, especially when you're tired, lonely, or longing for intimacy, especially when she looks at you with those old eyes of expectation, that gaze that once felt like home. But you're not that man anymore, and that gaze is no longer home, it's a trap, a beautiful, intoxicating trap. And now you see it for what it is. The call to be consumed, to be reborn, not as yourself, but as a version of you that fits her inner world. And no matter how tempting it is to feel chosen again, you remember the price. You remember how it hollowed you out, how it rewrote your instincts, how it made you perform your own erasure and thank her for the opportunity. So now, instead of leaning in, you pause, you breathe, You check in with yourself first, because the man who has done his shadow work doesn't move based on desire alone, he moves from alignment. And alignment doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it feels lonely. Sometimes it feels like walking away from the very thing your ego still craves. But it's real, and real always outranks comfort. And here's the paradox. The more real you become, the less reactive you are. You're no longer thrown off by drama, seduction, praise, or guilt. You see it all, and you stay rooted, not cold, not distant, just grounded. That stillness, that calm, it changes everything. The dynamic, the energy, the entire gravitational pull of the relationship begins to shift. Because now you're not spinning around her emotions, you've become your own center of gravity. That's when you start to see the unconscious behaviors for what they are, the overcompensating, the silent treatments, the emotional highs and lows, the desperate need for control masked as love, and instead of reacting, you witness. You no longer engage to fix it, soothe it, or earn your way back in, because you understand that her projections are not your responsibility. Her animus is not your battle to fight. And that realization is powerful, because most men believe that love means saving, that to be a good man you must help her evolve. But Jung warned us, if you let yourself be the container for her unconscious material, you will become infected by it. You will carry the burden of a war that was never yours to begin with, and it will eat you alive from the inside out. So you choose differently now. You choose sovereignty over saviorhood. You choose presence over performance. And most of all, you choose to be misunderstood rather than betray yourself again. That's maturity. Not being right, not being praised, but being whole, even if it costs you the fantasy of being the one. And slowly, something in you shifts. Your nervous system begins to settle. The inner chaos that once pushed you to prove, to chase, to explain, it quiets. Because you're no longer trying to earn your existence. You're simply living it, fully, truthfully. People feel this. Women feel it most of all. Some will still try to fit you into their fantasy. Some will project onto your strength, seeing it as threat or coldness. But you won't be shaken. Because now, you're aware. You see the projection before it takes hold. You feel when you're being summoned into a role, and you simply refuse to audition. You remain who you are, unfolding moment by moment, not to please, not to impress, but to express the wholeness you fought so hard to reclaim. And from that place you begin to experience a new kind of connection, one that doesn't begin with being needed, but with being met. One where the woman in front of you isn't looking for a savior, a symbol, or a stage partner. She's looking for truth. And you recognize her not because she desires you, but because she doesn't ask you to be anything other than who you are. There's no manipulation, no distortion, just two psyches meeting, without masks, without mirrors, without roles. It's rare, unfamiliar, almost too quiet at first, but it's real. And because it's real, it doesn't fill you with anxiety. It gives you peace. And that peace, it's your new compass. If a connection costs you that, it's not for you. If a woman's love asks you to shrink, to bend, to vanish into her image of you, it's not love. If her presence distorts your clarity, you walk, not as punishment, but as preservation. Because now you know your clarity is sacred. Your sovereignty is not a gift to be negotiated. It is the foundation of everything. This is the man Jung envisioned. Not perfect, not dominant, but conscious, awake, integrated. The man who has faced the animus, both hers and his own. The man who no longer fears being alone because solitude is where he found his truth. The man who no longer plays roles, because roles are for those who haven't met themselves yet. You are no longer a character in someone else's fantasy. You are no longer willing to be someone's psychological placeholder. their inner projection made flesh. You are a man, whole, centered, real, and that makes you untouchable, not because you are hard, but because you are true. And yet, the world will still try to pull you back in, not always with force, but with subtlety, with flattery, with longing glances and emotionally loaded silences, with phrases like, "I miss the way you used to be," or "You've changed." And the truth is, you have. That's the whole point. You're no longer emotionally pliable. You're no longer offering yourself up as a sacrificial source of identity for someone else's psyche to feed on. But that change threatens the old dynamic, and people, especially those who relied on your previous pattern, will resist it. There will be accusations. You're cold, you're selfish, you're difficult, all masks for the deeper truth. You're no longer manipulable. You no longer orbit around someone else's chaos, hoping to be thanked for your patience. You've stepped off the emotional carousel. You've learned to sit in stillness, to confront discomfort instead of avoiding it. And when she tries to pull you back into her fantasy, not even consciously, sometimes just through that old tone, that old script, you won't take the bait. You won't become her hero, her scapegoat, her emotional punching bag. Not because you're bitter, because you've grown. You understand now that fantasy-based relationships are not just emotionally exhausting, they're identity erasing. Every time you contort yourself to fit someone else's archetype, you amputate a piece of your soul. The wild part, the unexplainable part, the part that doesn't fit neatly into her dreams of a perfect man. And over time, those amputations add up. They leave you hollow. And the tragic irony is that the more you sacrifice, the more resentment grows. On both sides, because she senses the lie too. She feels the dissonance. And deep down, even if she can't name it, she begins to lose trust in the very image she created. Why? Because no projection lasts forever. The unconscious always wants truth, and the longer you resist that pull, the more your psyche rebels. You sabotage, you collapse. You say things you regret, not because you're weak, but because you've been silenced for too long. And that's when the disillusionment hits, for her and for you. The fantasy crumbles. And if you haven't done the work, you'll both blame each other. But if you have, you'll understand. You'll recognize it for what it is. Not betrayal, not failure, but an awakening. This is why Jung insisted that individuation is not just an intellectual concept, it's a confrontation with everything false. It's not about finding your best self. It's about finding your whole self. Even the parts you were told would make you unlovable, even the edges that don't fit cleanly into someone else's idea of who you're supposed to be. And when you reclaim those parts, when you stop asking for permission to be all of you, that's when the entire game changes. You no longer chase relationships, you attract resonance. You no longer audition for roles in someone's inner play, you live in reality, and if someone wants to meet you there, they're welcome. But you're no longer dragging people out of their fantasies. That's not your job. Your job is to stay rooted in what is real, even if it means being misunderstood, rejected, or labeled. Because now you know what's at stake. Your peace, your presence, your power. And these are not things you are willing to exchange. Not for love, not for sex, not for validation. Especially not for being cast as the man of her dreams. When that dream never allowed room for your truth, there's a deep grief in this realization, a mourning of what could have been if only both of you had met each other outside the veil of projection. But there's also freedom, because for the first time your heart isn't negotiating its worth. It's not waiting to be recognized. It's already whole, already enough. And that makes you immune to emotional games that once hooked you like clockwork. You begin to see clearly. Every time you were pulled into a fantasy, it was because you had not yet anchored yourself in your own reality. You had wounds, you had blind spots. You wanted to be seen so badly, you were willing to be imagined instead. But now you're done with that. You don't need to be romanticized, you need to be met. You don't need to be idolized, you need to be felt. You don't need to be someone's answer. You need to be someone who no longer asks the wrong questions like, why didn't she choose me? Or what could I have done differently? No. The real question is this: why was I trying to be chosen by someone who never saw me to begin with? And the answer is simple. Because you didn't yet know yourself. But now you do. You've been through the fire. You've seen how fantasy devours, how projections elevate you only to discard you the moment you become inconvenient. You've felt the confusion of being loved conditionally, the pain of realizing that your worth was always tied to your performance, and now, after all of that, you choose truth. You choose alignment over adoration. You choose depth over drama. You choose solitude over seduction that asks you to disappear. And from this place you begin to attract something different. Something not rooted in unconscious need, but in shared awareness. It's quieter, less flashy, but it feels like breathing. It feels like home. Not because you're filling a role, but because you're finally being received as you are. No masks, no metaphors, no manipulation. Just presence, just truth, just you. And that, more than anything, is your revolution. You are no longer an actor in someone else's script. You are the author now. This is the quiet power no one teaches you as a man. The ability to walk away from illusions. Not in bitterness, but in clarity. The power to be seen without selling yourself. To be desired without being devoured. To be loved not as an image, but as a presence. This is the man Jung envisioned when he spoke of individuation. Not perfect, not immune to pain, but no longer enslaved by it. Not reactive to every emotional tug, but rooted, calm, clear. It doesn't mean you won't still get pulled. There will be moments. Invitations to return to the old dance. The woman who says, "You're everything I've ever wanted." The one who looks at you like you're the answer to her unspoken longing. The fantasy disguised as fate. And part of you might still want to believe it. Part of you might still ache to be the man she dreamed about. But the wiser part of you, the one who walked through projection and came out whole, he knows better. He knows that to be someone's dream, you must first become someone else's ghost. And you're no longer willing to disappear just to feel wanted, because now you want something deeper. You want reality. You want love without performance, presence without pressure, intimacy without distortion. You want a woman who has met her own animus, who has seen the parts of herself that once turned men into ideas, into ideals, into hollow echoes of her longing. You want someone who doesn't need you to be perfect, only to be real. And most importantly, you want to stay with yourself, no matter who enters or exits your life. That's the true arrival. Not when you find the perfect partner, but when you become incapable of abandoning yourself for anyone. You walk differently now. You listen to your body. You trust your instincts. You notice the subtle tightening in your chest when something feels off, and instead of overriding it to stay in the story, you honor it. You speak up. You pull back. You protect your peace. Not like a fortress, but like a sacred flame. And the women who once tried to mold you, they fade. Not because you punish them, but because they no longer have access to you. You're not rude. You're just unavailable to dynamics that require you to betray yourself. This isn't arrogance. This is integration. This is a man who has stopped asking others to define his worth because he's done the work to find it within. He's cried the unshed tears, faced the boy who needed approval, sat in silence when there was nothing left to prove, and from that silence, he was reborn. This rebirth doesn't make you invulnerable. You'll still feel, you'll still love deeply, you'll still be open, but never unguarded. Because now you know what it costs to leave your post, to let someone else write your story, to become a reflection of a fantasy that was never yours to live. And because you know the cost, you protect your presence, fiercely, gently, unapologetically. This presence becomes your filter. You no longer chase compatibility, you embody it. You don't seek connection through force, you let the false ones fall away. And what remains is what was always meant to find you: truth. Resonance. A love that doesn't ask you to abandon your depth to feel wanted. And if that never comes, if the world keeps offering only illusions, you'll still be whole. Because now, for the first time, you don't need someone else to complete the sentence of your life. You've written it yourself, in pain, in fire, in silence, in truth. You've chosen yourself. And when a man chooses himself, when he no longer waits to be seen or saved or selected, he becomes untouchable. Not because he's detached, but because he's anchored. His value is not negotiable. His time is not a marketing campaign. His energy is not a gift given blindly. He gives because he chooses to, not because he needs to be needed. He stays because he's met, not because he's performing stability for someone else's storm. He walks away not because he's cold, but because he refuses to burn in a fire that was never his to tend. This is the end of the cycle. You've walked the path, from projection to presence, from fantasy to fullness, from being seen as a symbol to becoming a sovereign man. You are not here to be imagined, you are here to be real. And if that means being alone, then so be it. Because in that solitude, you've found something far greater than approval. You've found yourself,